Hi, Sandeep, Subhash. Let's give this a few more minutes for the other members to join.
Yeah, sure. Hello.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Hope you have a good weather in Vancouver.
Yes, the weather is very good in Vancouver. Where are you from?
Austin, Texas.
Okay, good. How is it hot on your side?
It will be 104 degrees in the next 4 hours.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'd been to Vancouver once for the OpenStack Summit. It was an awesome place.
2018, right? 2019. When was the OpenStack Summit last time?
I came in 2015, May.
May, okay, that one. Yeah, OpenStack Summit happens at one of the best places there. The most scenic, or the site is very nice for the conference.
Oh yeah, the convention center. I was like blown away by that. I was telling my wife and kids that we should go there sometime.
I know. It's beautiful. I attended another OpenStack Summit in 2018. I think that was the last one. If there's anything else that happened after that, I probably didn't attend OpenStack after that.
Yeah, but I stopped attending after my Barcelona Summit. I mean, Brocade got bought by Broadcom, and we were all.
Yes. And OpenStack Summits started to grow smaller and smaller, and then I think it wasn't as exciting as it used to be.
Yeah, it's saturated, which means the adoption was pretty good by the time, and then there was nothing new coming.
Correct. What is your full name? I'm seeing Vish.
Vishwanath Jayaraman.
Which company are you from?
Red Hat.
Red Hat. Good.
We probably met. Maybe you forgot. It's been a while.
Of course. I meet Red Hat a lot. I'm meeting Red Hat today actually on the lunch. So
nice.
We meet a lot of people from Red Hat, so it's good to see you.
So Bala,
go ahead.
I was just saying that Bala, me, and Tal, we had come to the Developer Summit from Red Hat last year.
Oh, you were together. Now I remember you. You were sitting next to Tal. Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Good. I think it's 9:03. We generally get overflow in our time at the end. I believe it's a working session, so I'm not expecting a lot of people, but I can see Wim's here, Tal's here, Bernard is here, Subhash, Sandeep, all the people who are very actively working. We can get started. What do you guys feel?
Fine for me.
Sure.
Fine for you. Good. Let's get started. So Wim, Tal, remind me where we left off last time. I believe we were finishing the section where Bernard was trying to help us understand the infrastructure requirements. And I saw on the Slack that Wim put together something. How should we start? Should we catch up from that section?
Yeah, I documented a little bit. Because it was not so clear for everyone what I said. I will prepare some slides to present what we do in R1 so that people already have a sense of what we are doing, right?
Okay.
To get a better view on what it is, and then we can already discuss maybe some improvements and stuff like that. But then at least people have a better understanding of what we already or what we do.
That's a very good idea. So I did try to create a section on R1, and then I had put some section on the gaps in R1. I think what you are going to basically present is to go deeper into that section to establish a little bit more understanding for what everybody's proposing for R2. Correct, Wim? Okay.
Yes, yeah.
And I think once you review that section, like the slides you have put together, I would like to go back to Bernard's requirements because I'm trying to summarize some of everyone's requirements into a section under that will help me create that high-level summary of all of these requirements in the document. So I can unshare my screen. And you can share, and let's go through your PowerPoint.
Yeah, okay. The other thing, Sana, very quick, I said that we were going to discuss the RAN side, right? So there was a meeting yesterday from Joseph, right, where he presented what he was doing.
Okay.
So he is using OAI. So we are starting to dig deeper in the capabilities, but they started to build an operator and stuff like that. So we started in SIG 2 to look at what it means to onboard a RAN into Nephew. So just FYI.
Is there a link? Yeah, is there a link to that project? I can take a look at that.
Yeah, so he also shared it. I will share. So there is somewhere on Slack the presentation that he did. He shared. So I'll send it to this channel and then during the meeting after my presentation. But you asked for an update, so I want to keep you.
Oh, that's an extremely important update. I was going to suggest that one of the next steps is to finalize on our ORAN open source functions, and that's where you're making progress. So that's excellent. I'll take a look after you send the link.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I put a few slides together to give you a better sense of ISO. The thing that Bernard was, my understanding, discussing is the dependency between infra and network function. So I call it infra to network function, or you can also turn it the other way around, right? So what we do today inside of Nephew, so it all starts, it actually all starts with a workload cluster, right? So as you know, we do a little bit of that. So hopefully you'll get a better sense of it. So how do we do it at the moment is we create a workload cluster. And this is one of the CRs in that workload cluster, but that's the most relevant one at the moment that actually describes some of the elements that we are using to reflect the dependency towards the infra, right? So in that we call it Nephew workload cluster package. We have a CR, which is a workload cluster, which you see here on the left-hand side. This is the one that is actually in the blueprint package as is, right? And what you see here is we are specifying a set of CNIs, and we're also specifying some interface information to actually say this cluster has these capabilities, right? So one thing that you already can point out right now is that this is not discovered or something like that. So this is basically, at the moment, we just tell, okay, we want the cluster and that's what is in it. And yeah, so we are using this information like the CNIs, for example, and the master interface to actually see whether this, whether we can actually deploy eventually onto this cluster, right? Besides this CR, but this is the most relevant for the infra dependency, we also have like repository credentials, packages that we need to install on the workload cluster and so on and so forth. So there's a bunch of things besides that in that package that are needed to actually get access to the cluster, to get the cluster up and running and so on and so forth. And there is a link as we use at the moment Cluster API as the way to instantiate the cluster. So that's a bit of background. So once you deploy a cluster, and so this is an example of two. So one on the left-hand side, it's an edge cluster. On the right-hand side is the region. You see that some of these parameters are actuated, right? So for example, you see that the names are filled out. So if you compare to the previous one, so we have here examples. So these are just placeholders. So and during our package variant sets, so PVS and PV, so what John built inside of Porch, we basically create clones of that blueprint package and we create variants based on the information that you point out, right? So we can say, okay, we need 5 edges, we need 10 regions. So you can basically play with that. And once that deployment, during that deployment, one of the CRs that is going to be acted on the management cluster is this CR, which represents basically the actual parameters that are used for later on for other activities, right? So for example, we see here, we have labels that we put in to say this is a region and this is the region. We have site types, whether it's edge or region, and so on and so forth. So there's a few parameters which get activated. Yeah, Sana, you raised your hand.
Yes, Wim, I wanted to understand how these parameters get filled in. Do you guys?
So when you,
Go
so
ahead.
when you create a PV, so when you create, either through the UI, right? So through the UI, you can, or through a CR that you just do kubectl apply, you can basically create what we call a package variant set, right? And you basically say, I need 5 clusters. And these are, for example, if you say edge, you can basically say 5, and then they will be edge 1 and edge 2, edge 3, edge 4. So there is a mechanism inside of ports right now which is the thing that is called package variants and package variant sets that do that. So in that package, for example, one of the things, no, you don't see it here. Yeah, so you can actually create some, so we have some functions, right? Through the functions that are being set up, we can actually do some, I create some variants of these packages. I have some slides, by the way, that I did somewhere else that I can share about that, right? On how that all works, but because there is various parameters or various ways to do it, and it can become a little bit complicated, but yeah.
So you didn't have to go into like too much detail, but I just wanted to get a sense of how some parameters are getting the user input from the UI and how some of them are getting supplied dynamically, and if they are supplied in a static, like manual way. And at some point, I just wanted to take a sense of that.
Yeah, you can do one-to-one, right? So you can basically say, I take one of these, and you create a PVS, and you basically say, I want this to be region, right? So you create, so it's a one-to-one, or you can do n-to-one, right? So the way that system basically works is I call the PVS, it's a for function or a range or whatever language you use in terms of programming. So you basically can replicate, right? And then during that replication, you can tell or give some specific parameters that are used for that particular clone or that particular variant that you're going to create. And then during the PV, so the package variant controller will take those parameters in and then actuate them within the CR. So that's how it works somehow, right? So, and in the PVS, the way you can create these variants, there is at the moment 3 ways to do so. You can create a list statically, right? So you can say, I need 5, and you define the 5 things manually. You can go and query a Kubernetes API server and get some dynamic data. And with that dynamic data, I mean the CR that you would query is predefined, and then depending on the return, you can actually, based on the information you get back, you can actually fan out, and the parameters that are coming back from each of these CRs can then be used to do that variant definition, if you will, right? So to change the parameters. So there is a whole system that we have in R1 that does that, and we use it we are using it quite extensively on one end to create cluster, but also to create network functions, right? But you can actually use it to replicate any KRM, right? So this thing is a very generic building block that allows us to do this variant creation and to do fan out in through some capabilities like the static parameter or this dynamic injection and stuff like that. So there is so this is actually something that is not really specific to network functions at all. You see?
Very good. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's also when I talk about Nephew, I see Nephew doing 2 things. We are focusing on use cases, but we are also creating specific primitives, and we are extending Kubernetes and the whole ecosystem with a set of primitives where we enhance the automation capabilities on the platform, right? And that's one example of it. Okay.
And it's possible to basically use these extensions for any flavor of Kubernetes with minor modifications. It's pretty standard within the Kubernetes. I think the construct will not change much if we use that.
What we have seen, of course, during the, let's say, the whole R1 flow, we saw that there is a set of capabilities to make it more flexible, right? So it works, right? But there could be some improvements. So we have seen already some improvements that we believe could help to make it more flexible and more easy to consume and stuff like that. So the idea is even going forward that we are extending that capability with to add some more flexibility to it, right? So there's a few enhancements that we want to have. Yeah. I have a set of slides on this. If you want, I can share also afterwards where I created what package variant, but it's rather technical. But yeah.
Okay, Wim, one more question. So as you're improving in the future and you're trying to make it more flexible so it can apply to more variants of the infrastructure environments, I was also wondering if we move from 3.5G network function to another kind of network function, the infrastructure requirements would also become more complex and it would change as well. So those extensions and those additional flexibilities would also be needed, right? If we are going to consume that for a production or a commercial grade deployment.
Yeah, so one of the things that you can already point out here, you see this is very limited, right? In terms of what we are doing. So that's one, I have it, you see it already here, is I listed myself, some improvements that I see by myself is today, most of these parameters are not specific to the cluster, but they are specific to a node or to a pool, right? Potentially, right? There is more parameters to it, and at the moment we don't really get feedback from the cluster itself. It's statically defined, right? So there is no mechanism that we get information. We could even go into a mode eventually where you have a running cluster, and we just discover this, and we don't do any
brownfield discovery. Correct.
Yes. Yeah. So these are things that I personally see. There's probably other people have other views on it, but you see that in this space, there is definitely room for improvement and this is where it's good to get some input from Bernard and from others to see what we should extend in this space to make this better and more aligned to a real world, right?
Excellent. I already see Bernard raised hand, Wim, if we could give him
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So I don't want to disrupt the presentation. So if you would like to first finish the presentation, we could also have the discussion later on as you wish.
No, if it's relevant to the topic, I prefer to discuss it right now already.
Okay.
If I see that the answer maybe comes later, then I will defer. Okay.
So first of all, I believe that sort of we will probably have to provide different sets of CRDs or CRs to sort of customize a cluster appropriately. That means probably it will not be possible to put all the specifications into one CR. We will probably need a couple of CRs to sort of adequately customize the work, the clusters. And therefore, sort of talking about this package variant sets, is it also possible to dynamically determine the amount of CRs which need to be generated? That means not only do a fan out, but potentially also sort of calculate in this context the needed CRs and then populate these CRs with appropriate values. That would be my first question.
At the moment, not, but I have had some discussion with John on how to do it. I don't think we conversed about it, but I have made a proposal to do what you ask. So to do a replication, so basically based on the parameters you get, be able to determine how many of another CR you need to be able to do it. For example, a use case is I have 10 replicas so I need, if you look to the way that Cluster API does it, and actually most of the cloud, the cluster provisioning systems do is they have a concept of a node pool, right? And in a node pool, you can do a replica of 10, for example. I need 10 nodes in this node pool, which means 10 servers or 10 VMs. And so so this would be already a parameter that you have that can be used to replicate. On that base, you can then replicate other resources. So that's one of the things that we probably need to extend. Yeah. I see more hands. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
If someone can do the moderation, because I don't see the people with the hands.
But to just sort of make that a little bit clearer, I believe that when we are setting up a workload cluster, there might be different infrastructure requirements depending on the network function to be onboarded. And therefore, there would be the need of sort of specifying ideally on the sort of network function basis or in a CIQ, somehow the required CRs, which would need to be instantiated. And this would be a dynamic sort of evaluation. That means you get the CIQ CR, and based on that determine I need to now set up the workload cluster with the following specs, and possibly a BGP CR with another set of specs. And this would all depend on what kind of network function I would want to onboard onto which cluster or node pool. And that's why this dynamic mechanism would be something which would be of interest for us, so that we can reuse our nodes and dynamically associate the workload as needed and customize the clusters as needed.
Now, Bernard, what we see here so far is really to get the initial workload cluster up and running, right? So that is the thing. The dynamic changes on top of it.
It's not like a change. Yeah, so it's before I can onboard sort of a network function correctly, there needs to be, for instance, kernel settings or BGP sessions established before the function can work. And the requirements regarding that might depend on the network function which you're onboarding. And therefore,
okay, yeah, we'll come to that. Yeah. We'll come to that a little bit. So that's coming to the next part to a certain extent. So probably it's better to do that discussion or a bit of the discussion once we are to the network function side.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one more question, Wim. Maybe that's also the kind of discussion that you would have during the network function slide. I'm also trying to map this whole experience from a user's perspective. When I have a network function and I want to onboard, all I know is that I want to onboard a UPF in, say, Edge 1 or West region. Like my intent is super high level. And all the system has at that moment is that, where is the corresponding Helm charts or the operators for deploying a UPF? That's here. How would the nephew as system, as a try to fetch the details that this particular network function requires, that many SRIOVs, that many VLANs, and then
you'll see in a bit. You'll see that. Yeah, wait a bit. Yeah, I think in the next slide I get there. Yeah.
Awesome. I want to see that.
I'm almost there. Yeah.
Okay, great.
More hands. Yeah, Tal, I think.
Oh, well, I didn't realize you had more slides. I'll let you finish and then talk.
Okay. Yeah. So this is kind of the cluster, right? So the next thing that we did for infra is we have a network CR, right? It's also a blueprint package with networks. So what that basically does, it basically sets up the network on which those clusters connect, right? So what this basically tells you is so this is kind of modeled around the VPC model. So you basically say, I need routing tables, I need bridge domains, which you don't have in VPC. You need, so you have a bunch of prefixes and stuff like that you can use. And this is going to, so this is basically setting up the networking based on, and this can be either static or dynamic based on clusters appearing and stuff like that. So this is kind of the networking side of the network package that is besides that workload cluster. You can basically deploy these completely independent, right? But you'll see when a network function gets created, that both the cluster side as well as the network, the blueprint package for the network will be consumed to see whether they can actuate stuff, okay? And in that network blueprint package, you can have multiple networks. So at the moment we have 3. We have one for what we call internal for N4, so between SMF and UPF, which goes cross-cluster, right? We have the internet VPC and we have the RAN VPC, right? Which we use to basically do emulation for the radio side. We can have more networks, so that is established. And what is also happening, so under the hood, then here is that for every cluster we create right now, so this is going to set up or interact with the IPAM system, interact with the VLAN system, and so on and so forth to ensure that the necessary prefixes are allocated and what have you, right?
The IPAM system that is on the management cluster?
Yeah, so this is at the moment on the management cluster, but this thing is built in such a way you can deploy it on workload cluster or management cluster. It doesn't really matter. But at the moment, the interface is with the IPAM. But I did, for example, an experiment a month ago with, what is it, the CNI plugin. So you can basically configure that IPAM on the workload cluster with, what is the thing that I think it's coming from Red Hat. I forgot the name. It will come back. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So basically, what it basically does is it allocates per cluster a set of resources to then use later on into the flow. Okay. Then comes our network function, right? So in the network function, so by the way, all of these are blueprint packages, right? So in the case of network, we don't really do a lot of customization for the time being. In workload cluster we do, but then in network function here, so this is also again a blueprint package. I just took out one CR that is mostly relevant for this network function with respect to the infra. But what you see, for example, if you take, I think this I took an AMF one. If you look at UPF, you will have 3. So this is the interface requirement CR that we defined. So this is basically, you remember when we discussed network functions, we said, okay, we'll create a blueprint package. So in that blueprint package, we are going to specify a set of requirements that network function has with respect to various things. So here, this is the CR that basically tells you, I need an N2 interface, and I need to have a MAC VLAN, and I need a VLAN. Right? Basically, that's what you say. And I want to connect it to this network. That's basically what you say. Yeah.
Yeah, this is not very abstract, though, because some network functions, they don't care about the interface that we'll get if it will be based on a MAC VLAN or another CNI. The only thing that they care is that they will take an interface, right? So this doesn't look very abstract to define the MAC VLAN CNI on a blueprint on the management cluster.
See, this is
for instance, it will be like a more abstract way. It will be that the network function will ask for a kernel interface, for instance, and if that kernel interface gets provided by using MAC VLAN CNI or OVS CNI, network function doesn't care.
Yeah, and that we can do that, Dimitri. So this is not, let's say, limited, but today our network function, if you look to the free 5GC, it requires MAC VLAN. So that's why we did MAC VLAN here, right? So this can be, so we have the capability to make this more flexible as you go. I'm just representing what we did today based on what the free 5GC wants. I can tell you for Nokia, this would work. This works. This is perfect for Nokia functions because we typically tell for this specific deployment, we would like to have SRIOV or we would like to have that and that and that. So this would be working nice for that. I'm not sure whether it works for everything. So again, we can make it more flexible, but we have something, right? That was the whole purpose of things. And so what is happening at the moment, so when we take this blueprint package, so and there will be more. So at the moment in our blueprint, in our packages, there's going to be there is much more interface. So for example, for UPF we have 3. So you can define how many you want, right? So we don't really care as such. So you can basically specify based on your blueprint package how many you want for that particular network function, right? And there is a number of parameters that you can customize. And based on that information, so one thing that we are not doing which I think we discussed before, is we are not using this information at the moment to see when we schedule it, whether this is actually possible, right? So that's one thing that is not happening. And so today, when we use the same construct that we use for the workload cluster, which is we have the same construct like the PV, the PVS, and the PV, right? So we can do fan out. How we do that at the moment is using the label. So for example, we can say, I want this network function, and I want to schedule it on all clusters that are edge, right? So you see here that we have this label of site type edge, right? So if you have 10 clusters with site type edge and you say, I want this network function to go on all of these sites, it will basically deploy, right? What we are not doing at the moment, we are not using the requirements, for example, to see whether that cluster has that capability. We are doing that when we actuate the data. So during the scheduling, this package gets selected to be deployed on a certain workload cluster. During the specialization pipeline in particular, we validate that this is possible. So for example, if there would be no network created, no VPC run network created, or that CNI is not available on the cluster, or there is no VLAN available, this deployment will fail and you will see it. But we are not doing that during the scheduling phase, if you see what I mean. So it's only happening during the time when we try to make it happen, and you will see then that certain things cannot be resolved. And if they are not possible to be resolved, we fail, right? So that's where you see that there is already a mechanism in place to reflect some requirements that the network function has towards the infra, right? For both the networking side as well as the cluster side, but it's fairly basic at the moment. And I think that's what I had. So yeah, so improvements that I personally see here is that, yeah, extending infra parameters like we discussed before, and also the information during, I use that information during scheduling, or potentially even, yeah, like Bernard said, is the dynamic influencing of the cluster based on this. So that is not there. Yeah. Bernard, you have your, I don't know who is first.
Yes. So my first question would be, so just imagine that we would do the validation during the deployment. Is there any possibility to quickly debug the issue? That means
Yes.
sort of you're sort of handing over all those requirements and capabilities which the cluster should sort of expose. And I was just wondering, how would I then debug and identify, here this CNI is not coming up, and therefore sort of we need to sort of fix that. What is the debugging approach here?
So the way it is exposed is in the blueprint package. So when you schedule it to be deployed on the cluster, each of the, so when we, during specialization, for each of the steps, you basically have a condition, right? Mm-hmm. And in that condition, you have either a status field, and you have a message, a reason. If the condition status is false, which means it's not good, and you get a message, you will see why that is not going through. So we will indicate CNI not available on cluster, for example.
This is indicated in which tool set? Is that Porch, or is that sort of in the logs, or where would I find this information?
We expose that both on the UI, right? So in the package, right? So if you look, so the way we work is a package. So we start from a blueprint package, right? Mm-hmm. In that you have a pipeline. Even there could be conditions, but typically there are none, right? So that's where it starts. What happens is during the PVS and PV, so we clone this blueprint package, and we basically say we want to deploy this on this cluster, right? Mm-hmm. A set of parameters gets, so a set of variations that are specific to that cluster get injected into that cluster. For example, the workload cluster CR that you see here, right? So the actual one gets injected in that package, right? During, so when this thing happens, there is a pipeline in the package that is going to be executed. That pipeline is a set of functions, or can be a controller. So it can be either functions or controllers. And the way this works is through what I call the conditional dance, right? So each of these functions, they do something. So for example, the way it typically starts right now is if you deploy a UPF, you have a UPF deployment function. It will see what are all the resources needed, right? You will see that if you have this interface CR into the package, you will have an interface function. The interface function will say, hey, actually, he will already check whether the CNI type is there or not. So he will use this CR as an input, and he will check, validate the parameters against the workload cluster CR, right? So that's what this function is doing. If it would be okay, he would say, so depending on the content of this, so in this case, he will ask, I need a VLAN, right? By default, we are only doing layer 3. So he will also ask, I need an IP address, right? And he will, I need an IP address in this network, right? And so then those things will run. And also the interface will say, because there is a CNI type, I need a network attachment definition, okay? So these are new conditions that are being set, and new functions or the function relevant for that condition are going to act, right? So they take in then their respective data in order to see whether they can fulfill the job, right? And if not, they either say why they cannot do it. And if they succeed, they will say, I succeeded. And then the next stage will happen until everything finished. Of course, if something doesn't work, the pipeline stops, right? And will indicate why that failure appeared. Where you see this data, so in the package that got scheduled on a particular workload cluster instance, right? You see there's a kept file with conditions, right? So kept, you'll see those conditions being set, and you will see that they failed. Also, our UI system is exposing that, right? So you can easily see why it failed, and you can then basically tell, yeah, what happened.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Yeah, I'm not seeing hands. So I see Tal, but I don't know who else.
Yeah, I think it's just me with the hand up.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you, Wim. So I want to point out two things, maybe three things more meta. So we had discussions about infrastructure management in SIG2, but we, as Wim kind of hinted, we didn't all agree. And we decided for R1, we just had to show some sort of capability, and this is what came out. But we're not all on board with this approach. So I can't represent everybody, but I'll represent maybe my perspective a little bit. Or one thing is that other people brought up as well is we're a little bit reinventing the wheel here. There are a few different projects out there that try to do a declarative Kubernetes cluster management interface. And the question is, well, did we evaluate them very carefully? We did not. If we want to create something different from them, well, what is the reason exactly? What is the problem with them that we're trying to fix here? We didn't do that. I think we decided to go our own path just because it was easier in terms of ownership and showing capability for R1, right? So I'm hesitant to treat this as definitive. I think we agreed as a group in SIG2 that, you know, none of this is definitive, right? It's just an example of how we could potentially do it. More substantially, I'll say that my approach, and I think it kind of answers the question that Sanaa had, and also Bernard. I have a POC that does things a little bit differently. For me, so one thing I think in R1, we really focused on the specialization pipeline, but I think what we're missing is an instantiation side, right? We kind of assume that config sync does a lot of the work, but we know that, you know, there are other deployment options too. And of course, when you get to infrastructure management, that's config sync can't do that, right? So I think we need a bigger interface towards instantiation, allowing for various kinds of plugins that would be able to do that. But what's important to me is that the unit of instantiation is not a cluster versus a workload. It's always together. So I call it a site plus its workloads. Because the point is the site might have some annotations that we get here. In most cases, they will come from a site inventory, or which involves both discovery and company inventory management, right? So both static parameters and dynamic ones. But our real innovation here is these requirements, right? So the package of a network function says what it requires, but let's say you're deploying a complete DU, right? And it might include 6 different network functions. Each one of them might have different kinds of requirements, right? And the solution architect who is actually designing the site, it would be a lot of work to go and find out if all the requirements don't conflict with each other. And as Demetrius mentioned, you can't expect the architect to actually be a system admin and get down to the level of SRIOV and who's using which lanes and PCIe, et cetera, right? Those are very machine specific, let alone cluster specific, right? So to automate this, which is our goal, right? To make it more automatic, the point is to include, I think, both the site itself and whatever data we currently have about the site, plus the workloads that we expect to deploy on it right now. So whatever this plugin is, it would take into account what it knows about the site, plus all the requirements of the workloads that will come into it together, and be able to validate that, right? Say, for example, if there's a conflict. And a lot of this work, I think, has to be dynamic, as Demetrius points out, right? For example, SRIOV lane assignment is something that should absolutely, I think, be done at the level of the cluster itself rather than in advance, which is far removed, I think, from where the cluster is. So I guess my general point is that this is still an open topic, and I think there's a lot to discuss. But for the purpose of SIG1, it's more important, yes, as Wim says, let's show SIG1 what we have right now. That is correct. But I think SIG1 should really keep an open mind and specify the requirements more generally from a telco perspective, what is needed, so we can really satisfy the automation requirements. Anyway, that's it.
I have a quick comment, Tal, to your comments. A great discussion today, by the way. I got a much deeper perspective on how we are solving everything in R1. One thing that you mentioned, which was very true to the current situation we are experiencing, and maybe Bernard can speak more to that. The current model of our infrastructure automation and network function deployment and automation is very reactive. It's reactive to the point that we are taking months in getting to understand the full requirements of the network functions, what they need from infrastructure, and then relaying that information to the infrastructure providers who are in fact building all the automation at the moment, but just the customizations and the exact requirements for that given network function, and to basically update our automations to reflect that. It's all reactive. And what you mentioned is that it has to be dynamic. It has to be on the fly in the runtime, a mechanism that fetches the information from the network function requirements and dynamically applies those requirements to the infrastructure, given the infrastructure has the provisions, has the automations, and has the capabilities at the infrastructure level to basically execute on those requirements. So that the whole experience could be more intent-driven. We just use that intent-driven word like overloadedly, but in reality, what we are actually doing in production today is not intent-based. It is very reactive to the needs. Every person is trying to basically understand all the requirements and trying to apply that in a silo, and then the next basically group for the network function deployment comes into the picture, and the synergy between the two is missing. And I think if Nephew can solve that, that would be an excellent model to adopt.
Yeah. Sana, one question I have based on your thing is like, one thing that Tal says is we try to calculate it ahead of time, right? Based on all the, I'm of the opinion that network function and workload cluster should be independent, right? But of course, if there are new requirements, they should potentially change if they can be accommodated. So in other words, deploying a cluster and deploying a network function are not necessarily associated. So in other words, the system should allow for that dynamicity. So that decoupling for me is important as a way to do it. Because otherwise you will be stuck with one network function or a few on a cluster and that's it. And so in my view, they should be decoupled. And then of course, if there are requirements that are not satisfied, right? There is two options you have. You either schedule to another cluster, or you can basically dynamically change the infra to accommodate the new requirement. And I think that's a very important, let's say, requirement, or let's say behavior, how we would like to architect it, because there is completely different ways to do that.
Right, right. So it's the same problem looking at in two different ways. We would never need an infrastructure or cluster configured without the intent of putting anything on it. Generally, we are preparing a cluster the way we do it today, right? We prepare a cluster in mind that X, Y, or Z network function has to go on it. And we prepare the cluster with that CIQ, with the requirements or the MAC VLANs or the SRIOVs, with that in mind that there is some network function that will go on it. So fortunately, unfortunately, telco network functions comes with a lot of unique requirements, and maybe in a private cloud situation, we are only building for what we know is needed for certain network functions. So maybe that's a problem with a private network function, private cloud environment to begin with, or the telco environment to begin with. And then the other big problem, Wim, that we have is something that Bernard mentioned somewhere, that we would like to dynamically use and reuse our same environment for different things. That's something totally missing today, right? If everything is fully dynamic, starting from the intent of deploying a network function all the way to the infrastructure details that are actually filled in and supplied at the runtime, it's going to give us a flexibility that I deploy UPF here. Now the UPF is not needed. I relieve that environment completely and deploy a virtual firewall there. Since the inception of cloud, 6-7 years in telecom, this has not been a reality. Like, we are technically living like the physical network functions world, but we are just doing the same thing on the cloud today. Once we allocate the capacity for one network function, that network functions live there forever because of all these constraints, like their specific CIQs, which is not automated, or the specific net infrastructure configuration details that are very relevant to that network function type. All that is creating a huge dependency for us to live in that PNF kind of a world. So I think a lot of these times,
my point is that if you do the second, you get the first for free.
Yeah.
If you do the dynamic side, right? If it's then a one-to-one relationship, it will dynamically adjust, you see? So if you do the second part, you get the first one out of the box. Because if you solve the dynamic case, right? Then you also have solved the one-to-one case, if you see what I mean.
Right, right. And that's what I'm saying, that it's the same thing if we look at that from a different perspective. Becoming very good at the cluster automation and the network function automation and supplying everything dynamically eventually does get us to the same result, that we are getting a better user experience, and we are able to achieve what we are all trying to achieve here, a very simplified deployment. And I'll go quiet. I'm sure other questions and other people have raised hands. I'll let them comment.
Yeah, I have also one practical point to make. I think, in my perspective, we should not treat like workload clusters as an empty shell and as dummy classes that they have no capability to actually take any decision on their own, and they just wait for the food to come from the management cluster. I think we need to actually target for a more workload delegation, because it's more practical also. For instance, when you want to actually have an inventory for your fabric topology, that you want to open certain VLANs to certain ports on certain switches of your workload cluster, and you have like 1,000 edge clusters to actually do that they differ, right? So all this information needs to be kept in the management cluster. So it is also a scaling question, because it is easier to keep some decisions near to workload clusters and let the workload cluster do some work than try to do everything from the management cluster, because that will not scale in some cases pretty well. Yeah, just food for thought. So more workload delegation, I think, is needed from that perspective also.
All right. Is there any other question? So Bernard, from your perspective, what are the main things? Maybe you should go back to your requirements now that hopefully we have a better understanding than we do right now. What are the things that we should focus on in to enhance, to make it better? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So again, so if I would have sort of a benchmark, then I would, no, not a sort of, let's say, a measurement of how well we are doing. I would take how long does it take to onboard sort of a network function onto a cluster where the infrastructure is provided by someone else compared to those people who are providing the network function. And this onboarding process needs to be structured and streamlined. I want to get away from this guessworking of how do we do this, rather to a situation where, for instance, we have, Tal mentioned it a little bit in the sense of we sort of have a set of environments, node pools, which sort of could expose a certain set of capabilities. Then we have a CIQ, which determines what we intend to actually roll out. And ideally, sort of with the help of the Nephew KPT functions, etc., we would be able to sort of establish a CI/CD process, which would then take the CIQ information, determine what the capabilities of the different sort of node pools are, and then calculate the appropriate sort of blueprint packages, etc., as you've shown here, to then allow for sort of a rollout of these network functions. And I described that also in this R2 document in the sense of, imagine that we would want to roll out the same network function onto two different types of cloud infrastructures. How would we sort of establish a process which is sort of well designed and allows us to sort of not have to handcraft and discuss over and over again sort of how to do the rollout. And in the same sense, having sort of one infrastructure cluster with a set of possible capabilities, take two different network functions, be it, for instance, Free5GC and ORAN DU, and deploy onto that infrastructure cluster sort of this network function, taking into account the specific infrastructure requirements.
Yeah. So in other words, I think the way I view this is more, so you want to have a dynamic provisioning of the new requirements onto the workload. Today it's static, right? So we don't do anything. So if it doesn't work, it fails, basically.
Yeah.
And so what you want to see is,
yeah.
Sorry.
And in addition, a well-defined process. So I would imagine that, for instance, if I've got a cloud infrastructure team providing me with this cloud capabilities, it would not only say, here's the sort of the node pool and here's the Kubernetes API which you could access, but rather it would also say, I've got a set of customization possibilities based on sort of a well-defined set of CRs, and you can make use of them in the context of your deployment. If you write a CIQ, please try to somehow reflect that. And then based on that, then we have a Nephew sort of process, which then takes this information and sort of evaluates the requirements of the network functions, and then sort of rolls out these network functions accordingly.
But so in other words, I mean, the way to maybe high level say it is that you would like to see more extensive of these CRDs, which are then going to be, today what we do is we basically say, we stop, right? What you want to see is we dynamically adapt based on those requirements. So we change the parameters of the workload cluster based on that. And then we try to adhere to that CIQ environment that is being requested.
Yeah. So, and to be very, very specific, I would imagine that sort of there might be blueprint packages which we do not know of, but which might be of relevance in the future. Timing considerations with between ports and whatever. Yeah, I've heard very crazy things which we might have to think about. So just imagine that sort of there is an infrastructure cluster provider, and he says sort of in addition to those standard mechanisms such as IPAM and VLAN, etc., I have got this special CR which allows to then, or CRD, which allows then to customize my cluster to account for this special capability. And if I'm sort of in the context of my workload cluster, there's an operator which will be able to evaluate any kind of information related to that CRD. Then we would sort of have to have a mechanism where we say, apart from those interfaces and network functions which we've seen so far, there's also the possibility to include additional types of CRs which might help with the cluster configuration before we do the actual onboarding of the network function.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Bernard, I think I would say the same thing in a different way, that we need an ability to plan ahead for increased capacity in some way, that we know that we might deploy something there, or we sometimes need room for future scalability, right? So there are two modes here, right? Automation could mean we want to be as efficient as possible and not allocate resources that we don't need at the moment, right, to leave them open. But I think as part of policy, right, this could be part of your topology, right? If you're, for example, deploying a site that's a CU, right, and you kind of know that you want to leave room for a potential application that will be running there. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. So I think there should be a way to express this as a requirement, right? So kind of a requirement that later on can be taken up by an actual workload. So something like a placeholder for workloads. I think that's something that could be modeled, very clearly.
Yeah. So any kind of guidance here, also from the automation work stream, would help here, in the sense of how should we structure CIQs, how should we sort of expose capabilities of the infrastructure, etc. And sort of based on that, say if we have this type of structure in place, this would allow us to better sort of do this type of dynamical binding of requirements. Yeah, and I'm open for any kind of sort of proposals here, but my concern is we are blocking our resources based on these sort of currently very statically handled configurations, which are handcrafted sort of every time we try to do an onboarding.
So would it be possible, Bernard, to share a little bit the current process and and expose some of the parameters that you use in order to see what that would mean?
Yeah, I've listed some of them already in the R2 document. Yeah, that means sort of setting up multiples, setting up sort of doing kernel sort of module settings, sort of establishing BGP sort of peerings, etc. Those types of customization options would potentially have to be reflected. And of course, we can go into more details here, but to be honest, I'm not so keen about saying we can now have a sort of a CRD for BGP peering or whatever. I'm more interested in the basic concept. That means if just take kernel module settings, yeah, and say, okay, we have a sort of a workload cluster, but in addition, we need to enable a certain kernel module, yeah. And this could be an example of saying some network functions might need that, others might not. How do I sort of customize my deployment process to dynamically account for this specific need of a network function?
So I'll add some more thoughts on this, right? And this kind of goes into policies, but requirements do not have to be specified as black and white, right? They could be prioritized. There could be requirements that are absolute requirements, right? But there could be requirements that are nice to have. That is, if you have that capacity on this particular site, then maybe do something a little bit different, right? So I think this is where policy languages become powerful because they can express these kind of interdependencies better, right? So for now, at least, we're specifying requirements, what we're seeing on screen right now, right, as absolutes, right? This is what is needed for this particular net function to work. but I think we can draw inspiration from and even work with policy frameworks that allow more complicated and situational, right, allocations. So, but yeah, I think that should be our requirement.
I can imagine that, but sort of just to be very specific here, I believe we should get this black and white scenario sort of in a good shape, and then we can go to this more sort of refined scenarios.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah, I agree. Any other thing?
I think we're out of time, but I wonder, Sana, if you could kind of lead us towards the next steps, because it's, in my opinion, it's this is a very, very, very big part of Nephew, right? It's not something I think we should just decide. You know, we're talking about the kind of high level requirements of what we would want such a system to do. But I kind of think it could take many weeks of careful design to really create an architecture that would satisfy those requirements.
I agree.
Yeah.
And Tal, we are not coming up with the eventual design or the full architecture in the discussions that we are having to consolidate our ideas for R2. I think what we really need to converge to is what we are doing in R2. So for example, on a super high level, what I have understood over the last few meetings is that we are going to extend, possibly, we are going to extend whatever is done on the ORAN 5G, free 5GC, and probably if we find opportunity to include something on ORAN, whatever was done on the infrastructure automation, what we saw here today, could be taken a step further to improve some of those parameters to basically be deployed more dynamically and trying to basically improve the user experience and automation a little more end-to-end, in which we are trying to gather more feedback from Bernard, trying to see what additional parameters can be included, trying to see the similar situation for RAN. We have a lot of network functions in telco which have a very hard dependency on these cluster configurations and these SIOV and DPDK and all of that is going to be repeated in ORAN as well. So we'll probably experience a very similar strict dependencies on these parameters to be configured ahead of the network function deployment. I think with this exercise of the free 5GC, and maybe if we include ORAN for additional complexity and experience on joining the two together, we are just on that track to improve the exercise of what we did in R1 to R2 better. And one thing, I will just give you last comment installed, then I'll let you bring up your comment. How can we focus on the experience? Like if I have to deploy a user plane, basically a UPF first, and I want to dynamically scale out my UPF, how much of that can happen dynamically, like with less work done ahead of time for that? To which degree can we find that success? These are just high-level thoughts in my mind to where we are converging with our overall requirements for R2. Go ahead, you have questions.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I wanted to add, you know, this is, we're really, you know, we have three different kinds of companies involved in FEO, right? Telcos, vendors, and cloud providers. And this is exactly where the three come together, right? This is part of the complexity. So to be very frank, right, we have two providers, cloud providers active at Nephew right now, which is Google and Red Hat. I'm hoping, and I know I have talked to Bala and Vish about this, that we really want to get more feedback from the cloud providers about, because at the end of the day, the cloud providers are those that instantiate this, right? To turn this into reality and actually install the clusters and give access to the clusters,
right,
the fabric, and everything else.
To some level, they're artifacts, right? The automations coming from the cloud providers to accomplish that.
Exactly, right. So you know, I can represent Google's perspective here. I really would like Red Hat also to step up and give a lot of feedback on this issue as well. This is where we really plug into Nefio strongly with our infrastructure. So it's especially important for us to get this right, not only in terms of what the expressiveness for telcos, which is the starting point, right? For all of us, telcos are the customer, right? So a customer-oriented approach always focused on the user experience from you, from Bernard, and from others, right? But we have to step in and make sure that what is expressed here is possible and does fit with our own automation pipelines for actually creating these realities, right? So, so this goes back to my concern before that, you know, there already exist declarative interfaces for these things. So do we want to add another one that's abstracted? Will it be translated into cluster API, cross-plane, etc.? There are concerns here about reinventing the wheel, right? Because we already provide a lot of interfaces for automating the infrastructure. So it's a very big topic. But the meta issue I wanted to make is asking Red Hat really to step in more on this topic and provide more feedback. That's it.
And Tal, if something's done, I think we need to focus on the gaps, what's not done, so that the project can really benefit the organizations which are going to use that. And I'm also thinking on the lines that I don't want this whole effort to continue in an open source project and stay in the sandboxes. What are the potential opportunities that some of that can be adopted early on by some of these infrastructure providers, and we could start using them? And if we have to do that, then it's really important for the active contribution by all the participants to ensure what's in the ground and what's happening and how the adoption would happen eventually to benefit us. So for example, if we are deploying ORAN, a lot of organizations are focusing on ORAN. 5G is becoming more mature, saturated in that sense, but ORAN is new, fresh. It's coming in with lots of deployments all around the world. What is it that we can adopt early on in the ORAN deployments and kind of achieve some efficiencies from the efforts that we are doing here? There is a lot of opportunity for all of us at the same time.
No, that's exactly true. I mean, RAN is not our use cases are RAN, but would it be a mistake for Nefio to decide to be an ORAN implementation of IMS and DMS? There are definitely many advantages to that, possibly disadvantages too. There are a lot of very big questions. And I'll mention too that Google already has a TNA product, right, which incorporates Nefio and provides many primitives for our edge GDC edge automation, right? So this is a very big part of our product. We have a whole team supporting it. So it's already there, right? Google at least.
I know. For Google, it's there. I want this to be adopted everywhere. All Kubernetes distributions, so that this could grow faster as a project.
Exactly, right. And the problem always with these abstractions is, well, on the one hand, it allows you the portability, you know, write once, run everywhere. But on the other hand, how do you expose the actual specialized differentiating features at that particular platform, right? So yeah, we haven't done very careful modeling of this, right? But I think as Bernard pointed out, you know, it's all about the modeling. I mean, it doesn't have to be a single CR, it could be multiple CRs. But my concern is we're reinventing wheels. There have been so many efforts done about modeling infrastructure declaratively. Yeah, so we're doing two things at the same time, right? Implementing and actually showing code that does something that works in R1, especially. But the question is for R2, do we want to continue in this kind of ad hoc way, or do we want to do this in a more deliberate fashion, right?
Tal, two things. I want R2 to take us one step closer to doing something in production faster, something that is applicable to our situation and that is adoptable. We'll work on the adoption side with whatever vendors we are working with, but something so relevant to our problems and our needs that we could really force the adoption within our organizations. If we keep that high level North Star on our tools deliverables, I think we'll make a step closer to what we want to accomplish with Nefio, being in this community, all of us. And I have another very high level question. So basically, the document is all over right now. We have so many discussions, so many ideas exchanged. Maybe the convergence is needed. I would request everyone who has done the contributions in light of what has been discussed so far to basically work on your requirements again. Just give it one skim through and just take a look at things, how this should reflect with all the discussions that we had. I'll give it my own pass. I'll look into all the requirements again and try to clean up the document a little for the SIG automation to absorb and understand. And it's a question to you as well, Tal and Wim. how would you want us to provide you the final version of the document that is actually useful for you as like a feedback or input? I know it's not in that shape at the moment.
I need to go through it. I was going to go through it again and get you some feedback. So I don't have a good answer right now, but I will probably early next week.
Okay, I have a mind map. I have a feeling that there are repeated patterns of asks throughout the document. I just need to sit and consolidate that, but I don't want to do it all by myself because I want everyone's voice to be truly reflected. So if someone feels that their requirements have to be updated, please do so. And then we can give it an attempt, Wim, to basically converge that requirement into one story. That would make sense for our feedback for R2.
So yeah, I'm going to go through the document again, and then yeah, so I'll get you better feedback, and then at least from my perspective.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Wim.
I have for myself, you know, always this slight confusion about the roles of the two SIGs, right? It was never clear to me who owns architecture, right? This SIG is called network architecture, but I think most of the work is really specifying the requirements for network architecture, and then SIG2 would actually develop products, and the architecture maybe emerges from it, or it's part of our planning. It's on a case-by-case basis. But
I think, Dol, it's a two-way handshake. Some of these requirements will drive the architecture, and some of the developments are actually supporting some of the architectural directions that make sense. I don't feel it's going to be like a clear isolation between this group and the other group. I think we need to constantly talk to each other, and the architecture would evolve from a lot of those discussions. It's something like incremental. I don't think it's like something waterfall, like ONAP put an architecture out there, and the code could never satisfy that architecture eventually. I'm happy to see your thoughts. I have a feeling
that makes sense. Yeah. So maybe I'll say in terms of myself, because you asked both of us, you know, what we would need.
Right.
I wonder how if we could take the current document and turn it into a set of diagrams. You know, I know that sounds silly, maybe, what's the big difference? But I think the more architectural diagrams showing what requires what, you know, we talk a lot about north, south, east, west APIs.
Right. I can attempt to develop a diagram out of that. That would help you visualize the whole 5G core and O-RAN deployment and how it interacts with the rest of the world. I'll give it a stab, and then I will let the community comment on it so that everyone's feedback is captured.
I think that would be very helpful to, hopefully to everybody, but to me, it would be helpful.
I have a mind map for that. Maybe I'll give it a try.
I'm sure you do. You always see the entire picture from above, so I'm sure it's in your brain.
Okay.
Okay.
So we are 12 minutes over. We are next meeting
I think the
again.
reason to present this is to get a better sense between what happens to SIG1 and SIG2, right? So that's the reason I did it, because I think if you don't understand what we did, at least you cannot say what to improve, right? So
correct.
We have
that was very helpful.
The collaborative way of approaching things, right? So, and we have to do more of this, in my view, to make it easier.
We should even represent, like some of the SIG1 people should represent in the SIG automation meetings as well. To converge that, like to basically help your efforts one step further. And we should look into that. Once Kaushik is back, I think we can take rounds to represent us one by one in the SIG automation, so that we can fetch that details and bring it back to our community for this kind of convergence. And you guys are very good at representing here every time on every meeting, and you guys have been very helpful in driving the discussions.
Yeah, I think there are a few people that go to as many meetings as they can, including SIG3, but it's it all depends on people's schedule and what their how much space they have to work on FEO in general. Right.
We are 14 minutes over, which is good. We had some excellent discussion today. I think our next meeting is Monday, same time, 9 a.m. And I will post that on the Slack channel again. And I'm so sorry, I cannot figure out the problems with the calendar. I didn't spend too much time on that, but I just knew that myself and Kaushik both had some problems and didn't go back to that. I'll try going back to that and seeing if I can actually post that on the calendar as well. But just announcing to the group here, we'll meet again at 9 a.m. Monday for the next SIG architecture meeting. And I'll put that on the Slack as well. All right, then we can take a leave now. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.